Hello and welcome back. We're reading His Majesty's Dragon, Book 1 of the Temeraire series. And we are in the middle of a huge scene right now. Choiseul, we found out, is a traitor and tried to take Lily hostage to get back into France. Not going to happen. So this is the back end of Chapter 11. Let's see how far we can get you here tonight. Hopefully we'll get you all the way to Chapter 12. Thanks for bearing with me. Choiseul did not rouse for the better part of a day, and when he woke, he was thick-tongued and confused in his speech. Yet by the next morning, he was once again in command of himself, and at first refused to answer any questions whatsoever. Precursoress had been ringed round by all the other dragons and ordered to remain on the ground under pain of Choiseul's death. A threat to the handler was the one thing which could hold an unwilling dragon, and the means by which Choiseul had intended to force Lily to defect to France were now used against him. Precursoress made no attempt to defy the command, but huddled into a miserable heap beneath his chains, eating nothing and occasionally keening softly. "Harcourt," Lenton said at last, coming into the dining room and finding them all assembled and waiting. "I'm damned sorry, but I must ask you to try. He has not spoken to anyone else, but if he has the honor of a yellow rat, he must feel some explanation owed you. Will you ask him?" She nodded, and then drained her glass, but her face stayed so very pale that Lawrence asked quietly, "Should you like me to accompany you?" "Yes, if you please," she said at once, gratefully, and he followed her to the small, dark cell where Choiseul was incarcerated. Choiseul could not meet her gaze, nor speak to her. He shook his head and shuddered and even wept as she asked him questions in an unsteady voice. "Oh, damn you!" she cried at last, crackling with anger. How could you have a heart to do this? Every word you said to me was a lie. Tell me, did you even arrange that first ambush? On our way here? Tell me!" Her voice was breaking, and he dropped his face into his hands. Now he raised it and cried to Lawrence, "For God's sake!" What was that? That sounded a little Scottish there, Nick. "For God's sake, make her go. I will tell you anything you like, only send her out," and dropped it back down again. Lawrence did not in the least want to be his interrogator, but he could not prolong Harcourt's suffering unnecessarily. He touched her on the shoulder, and she fled at once. It was deeply unpleasant to have to ask Choiseul questions, still more unpleasant to hear that he had been a traitor since coming from Austria. "I see what you think of me," Choiseul added, noting the look of disgust on Lawrence's face. "And you have a right, but for me, there was no choice." Lawrence had been keeping himself strictly to questions, but this paltry attempt at excuse inflamed him beyond his resistance. With contempt, he said, "You might have chosen to be honest and done your duty in the place you begged of us." Choiseul laughed, but with no mirth in the sound. "Indeed, and when Bonaparte is in London this Christmas time? What then? You may look at me that way if you like. I have no doubt about it. But I assure you if I thought any deed of mine would alter that outcome, I would have acted." "Instead, you've become a traitor twice over, and helped him, when your betrayal could only be excused if you had been sincere in your principles," Lawrence said. He was disturbed by Choiseul's certainty, though he would never conceive of giving any sign as much. "Ah, principles," Choiseul said. All his bravado had deserted him, and he seemed now only weary and resigned. "France is not so under strength as you are, and Bonaparte has executed dragons for treason before. What do principles matter to me, when I see that the shadow of the guillotine hanging upon Precursoress? And where was I to take him? To Russia? He will outlive me by 2 centuries, and you must know how they treat dragons there. I could hardly fly him to America without a transport. My only hope was a pardon, and Bonaparte offered it only at a price." "By which you mean Lily," Lawrence said coldly. Surprisingly, Choiseul shook his head. No, his price was not Catherine's dragon, but yours. At the blank look upon Lawrence's face, he added, The Chinese egg was sent as a gift for him from the imperial throne. He was meant to receive it. He did not know Temeraire was already hatched. Choiseul shrugged and spread his hands. I thought perhaps, if I killed him... Lawrence struck him full across the face with such force as to knock him onto the stone floor of the cell. His chair rocked and fell over with a clatter. Choiseul coughed and blotted blood from his lip, and the guard opened the door and looked inside. Everything all right, sir? He asked, looking straight at Lawrence. He paid not the slightest mind to Choiseul's injury. Yes, you may go, Lawrence said flatly, wiping blood from his hand onto his handkerchief as the door closed once again. He would ordinarily have been ashamed to strike a prisoner, but in this moment he felt not the slightest qualm. His heart was still beating very quickly. Choiseul slowly set his chair back upright and sat down once more. More quietly he said, I am sorry. I could not bring it to myself in the end, and I thought instead... He stopped, seeing the color rise again in Lawrence's face. The very notion that for all these months such malice had been lurking so close to Temeraire, averted only by some momentary quirk of conscience on Choiseul's part, was enough to make his blood run cold. With loathing, he said, And so, instead, you tried to seduce a girl, barely past her schoolroom years, and abduct her. Choiseul said nothing. Indeed, Lawrence could hardly imagine what defense he could have offered. After a moment's pause, Lawrence added, You can have no further pretensions to honor. Tell me what Bonaparte plans, and perhaps Lenton will have precursors sent to the breeding grounds in Newfoundland, if indeed your motive is for his life, and not for your own miserable hide. Choiseul paled, but said, I know very little, but what I know I will tell you, if he gives his word to do as much. No, Lawrence said. You may speak and hope for mercy. You do not deserve if you choose. I will not bargain with you. Choiseul bowed his head, and when he spoke, he was broken, so faint Lawrence had to strain to hear him. I do not know what he intends, precisely, but he desired me to urge the weakening of the covert here, most particularly, to have as many men sent south to the Mediterranean as could be arranged. Lawrence felt sick with dismay. This goal, at least, had been brilliantly accomplished. Does he have some means for his fleet to escape Cadiz? He demanded. Does he suppose he can bring them here without facing Nelson? Do you imagine Bonaparte confided in me? Choiseul said, not lifting his head. To him, also I was a traitor. I was told the tasks I was to accomplish, nothing more. Lawrence satisfied himself with a few more questions that Choiseul truly knew nothing else. He left the room feeling both soiled and alarmed, and went at once to Lenton. The news cast a heavy pall upon the whole covert. The captains had not broadcast the details, but even the lowliest cadet or crewman could tell that a shadow lay upon them. Choiseul had timed his attempt well. The dispatch rider would not reach them again for 6 days, and from there 2 weeks or more would be required to see any portion of the forces from the Mediterranean restored to the Channel. Militia forces and several army detachments had already been sent for. They would arrive within a few days, to begin emplacing additional artillery along the coastline. Lawrence, with additional cause for anxiety, had spoken to Granby and Holland to raise their caution on Temeraire's behalf. If Bonaparte were jealous enough of having so personal a prize taken away, he might well send another agent, this one more willing to slay the dragon he could no longer claim. You must promise me to be careful, he told Temeraire as well. Eat nothing unless one of us is by and has approved it, and if anyone whom I have not presented to you seeks to approach you, do not under any circumstances permit it, even if you must fly to another clearing. I will have a care, Lawrence, I promise, said Temeraire. I do not understand, though, why the French Emperor would want to have me killed. How could that improve his circumstances? He would do better to ask them for another egg. My dear, the Chinese would hardly consent to give him a second where the first went so badly astray while in the keeping of his own men. He said, I'm still puzzled at their having given him even one. Indeed, he must have some prodigiously gifted diplomat at their court. I suppose his pride may be hurt to think that a lowly British captain stands in the place which he had meant to occupy himself. Temeraire snorted with disdain. I am sure I would never have liked him in the least, even if I had hatched in France, he said. He sounds a very unpleasant person. Oh, I truly cannot say. One hears a great deal of his pride, but there's no denying he is a very great man, even if he is a tyrant, Lawrence said reluctantly. He would have been a great deal happier to be able to convince himself that Bonaparte was a fool. Lenton gave orders that patrols now were to be flown only by half the formation at a time, the rest kept back at the covert for intense combat training. Under cover of night, several additional dragons were secretly flown down from coverts at Edinburgh and Inverness, including Victoriatus, the Parnassian, whom they had rescued what now seemed a long time ago. His captain, Richard Clark, made a nice point of coming to greet Lawrence and Temeraire. I hope you can forgive me for not paying you my respects and my gratitude sooner, he said. I confess at Laggan I had very little thought for anything but his recovery, and we were shipped out again without warning, as I believe were you. Lawrence shook his hand heartily. Pray, do not give it a thought, he said. I hope he is wholly recovered? Entirely, thank heaven, and none too soon either. Clark said grimly. I understand the assault is expected at any moment. And yet the days stretched out, painfully long with anticipation, and no attack came. 3 more Winchesters were brought down for additional scouting, but one and all they returned from their dangerous forays to the French shores to report heavy patrols at all hours along the enemy's coastline. There was no chance of penetration far enough inland to acquire more information. Levitas was among them, but the company was large enough that Lawrence was not obliged to see much of Rankin, for which he was grateful. He tried not to see the signs of that neglect, which he could do no more to cure. He felt he could not visit the little dragon further without provoking a quarrel, which might be dangerous, disastrous to the temper of the whole covert. However, he compromised with his conscience so far as to say nothing when he saw Holland coming to Temeraire's clearing very early the next morning with a bucket full of dirty cleaning rags and a guilty expression. A great coldness settled over the camp as night came on Sunday, the first week of waiting gone. Volatilis had not arrived as expected. The weather had been clear, certainly no cause for delay. It stayed so for 2 further days, and then a third. Still, he did not come. Lawrence tried not to look at the skies, and ignored his men doing the same, until that night he found Emily crying quietly outside the clearing, having crept away from the barracks for a little privacy. She was very ashamed to be caught at it, and pretended there was only some dust in her eyes. Lawrence took her to his rooms and had some cocoa brought. He told her, I was 2 years older than you are now when I first went to sea, and I blubbered at night for a week. She looked so very skeptical at this account that a laugh was drawn from him. No, I'm not inventing this for your benefit, he said. When you are a captain and you find one of your own cadets in similar circumstances, I imagine you will tell him what I have just told you. I'm not really afraid, she said, weariness and cocoa having combined to make her drowsy and unguarded. I know Excidium would never let anything happen to Mother, and he is the finest dragon in all of Europe. She woke up at having made this slip, and added anxiously, A Temeraire is very nearly as good, of course. Lawrence nodded gravely. Temeraire is a great deal younger. Perhaps he will equal Excidium one day, when he has more experience. Yes, just so, she said, very relieved, and he concealed his smile. 5 minutes later she was asleep. He laid her on the bed and went to sleep with Temeraire. Lawrence! Lawrence! He stirred and blinked upwards. Temeraire was nudging him awake urgently, though the sky was still dark. Lawrence was dimly aware of a low, roaring noise, a crowd of voices, and then the crack of gunfire. He started up at once. None of his crew were in the clearing, nor his officers. "What is it?" Temeraire asked, rising to his feet and unfurling his wings as Lawrence climbed down. "Are we being attacked? I do not see any dragons aloft." "Sir! Sir!" Morgan came running into the clearing, nearly falling over himself in his haste and eagerness. "Volley is here, sir, and there has been a great battle, and Napoleon is killed." "Oh, does that mean the war is over already?" Temeraire asked, disappointed. "I have not even been in any real battles yet." "Perhaps the news may have grown in the telling. I should be surprised to learn that Bonaparte is truly dead," Lawrence said. But he identified the noise as cheering, and certainly some good news had arrived, if not of quite such an absurd caliber. "Morgan, go and raise Mr. Holland and the ground crew with my apologies for the hour, and ask them to bring Temeraire his breakfast." "My dear," he said, turning to Temeraire, "I will go and learn what I can, and return with the news soonest." "Yes, please, and do hurry," Temeraire said urgently, rearing up on his back legs to see above the trees what might be in progress. The headquarters was blazing with light. Volley was sitting on the parade grounds before the building, tearing ravenously into a sheep. A couple of groundsmen with the dispatch service keeping off the growing crowd of men streaming from the barracks. Several of the young army and militia officers were firing off their guns in their excitement, and Lawrence was forced to nearly push his way through to reach the doors. The doors to Lenton's office were closed, but Captain James was sitting in the officers' club, eating with scarcely less ferocity than his dragon, and already all the other captains were with him, having the news. "Nelson told me to wait, said they'd come out of port before I had time to make another circuit," James was saying out of the corner of his mouth, somewhat muffled by toast, while Sutton attempted to sketch the scene on a piece of paper. "I hardly believed him, but sure enough, by Sunday morning, out they came, and we met them off Cape Trafalgar, early on Monday." He swallowed down a cup of coffee, all the company waiting impatiently for him to finish, and pushed his plate aside for a moment to take the paper from Sutton. "Here, let me," he said, drawing little circles to mark the position of the ships. 27 and 12 dragons of ours, against 33 and 10. "Two columns, breaking their line twice?" Lawrence asked, studying the diagram with satisfaction. Just the sort of strategy to throw the French into disarray, from which their ill-trained crews could hardly have recovered. Now, what he's describing there, I believe, is historically accurate, minus the dragons. At the Battle of Trafalgar, naval battle, did happen, the fleets of Spain and France against England, and I believe Nelson had this novel strategy of cutting their lines twice like that. Very risky, but as Naomi Novik brings up here, the French were just not as well-trained gunners, couldn't handle it, scattered the fleets. And it's also the French and the Spanish that weren't as coordinated. Look, you probably already know about it. You can look it up. If somebody drops their favorite link to their favorite YouTube video or what have you to look it up, it's worth checking it out and comparing to what you're hearing here. So, which their ill-trained crews could hardly have recovered. What? Oh, the ships, yes, with Excidium and Latificat over the weather column, mortiferous over the lee, James said. "It was hot work at the head of the divisions, I can tell you. I couldn't see so much as a spar from above the clouds of smoke. At one time I thought for sure victory had blown up. The Spanish had one of those blasted Flecha del Fuegos over there, dashing about quicker than our guns could answer. He had all her sails on fire before Latificat sent him running, with his tail between his legs." "What were our losses?" Warren asked, his quiet voice cutting through the high spirits of their excitement. James shook his head. "It was a proper bloodbath, and no mistake," he said somberly. "I suppose we have near 1,000 men killed, and poor Nelson himself came in a hair's breadth of it. The fire breather..." Well, now, and what I do know historically is Admiral Nelson was killed in the Battle of Trafalgar. So slight change here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost positive. Poor Nelson came within a hair's breadth of it. The fire breather set alight one of Victory's sails, and it came down upon him where he stood on the quarterdeck. A couple of quick-thinking fellows doused him with the scuttlebutt, but they say his metals were melted to his skin, and he'll wear them all the time now. 1,000 men. God rest their souls, Warren said. Conversation ceased. and when finally resumed, it was at first subdued. But excitement, joy, gradually overcame what perhaps was the more proper sentiments of the moment. "I hope you will excuse me, gentlemen," Lawrence said, nearly shouting as the noise climbed to a fresh pitch. It precluded any chance of acquiring further intelligence for the moment. "I promised Temeraire to return at once. James, I suppose that the report of Bonaparte's demise is a false one?" "Yes, more's the pity. Unless he falls down in an apoplexy over the news," James called back, which roused a general shout of laughter that continued by natural progression into a round of hearts of oak, and the singing followed Lawrence out the door and even through the covert, as the song was taken up by the men outside. By the time the sun rose, the covert was half empty. Scarcely a man had slept. The prevailing mood could not help but be joyful, almost to the point of hysteria, as nerves which had been drawn to their limits abruptly relaxed. Lenton did not even attempt to call the men to order, and looked the other way as they poured out of the covert into the city, to carry the news to those who had not yet heard and mingle their voices into the general rejoicing. Whatever scheme of invasion Bonaparte has been working towards, this must surely have put paid to it, Chenery said exultantly later that evening, as they stood together on the balcony and watched the returning crowd still milling more slowly about in the parade grounds below, all the men thoroughly drunk, but too happy for quarreling, snatches of song bursting out occasionally to float up towards them. "How I should like to see his face." I think we've been giving him too much credit," Lenton said. His cheeks were red with port and satisfaction, as well they might be. His judgment to send Excidium had proven sound, and contributed materially to the victory. "I think it clear he does not understand the navy so well as the army and the aerial corps. An uninformed man might well imagine that 30 ships of the line had no excuse to lose so thoroughly to 27. "But how can it have taken his aerial division so long to reach them?" Harcourt said. "Only 10 dragons, and from what James said, more than half of those Spanish. That is not a tenth of the strength he had in Austria. Perhaps he has not moved them all from the Rhine after all." "I've heard the passes over the Pyrenees are damned difficult, though I've never tried them myself," Chenery said. "But I dare say he never sent them. Thinking Villeneuve had what forces he needed, and they've all been lolling about in the covert and getting fat. No doubt he's been thinking all this time that Villeneuve would sail straight through Nelson, perhaps losing 1 or 2 ships in the process, expecting them daily, and wondering where they were. And we here biting our nails meanwhile for no good reason." "And now his army cannot come across," Harcourt said. Quoth Lord St. Vincent, "I don't say they cannot come, but they cannot come by sea," Chenery said, grinning. "And if Bonaparte thinks to take Britain with 40 dragons and their crews, he's very welcome to try, and we can give him a taste of those guns the militia fellows have been so busily digging in. It would be a pity to waste all their hard work." "I confess I would not mind a chance to give that rascal yet another dose of medicine," Lenton said. "But he will not be so foolish. He must be content with having done our duty. We must be content with having done our duty, and let the Austrians have the glory of polishing him off. His hope of invasion is done." He swallowed the rest of his port and said abruptly, "There is no more putting it off, though, I'm afraid. We cannot need anything more from Choiseul now." In the silence that fell among them, Harcourt's drawn breath was almost a sob. But she made no protest, and her voice remained admirably steady as she merely asked, "Have you decided what you will do with Precursors?" "We will send him to Newfoundland, if he will go. They need another breeding sire there to fill out their complement, and it is not as though he were vicious," Lenton said. "The fault is with Choiseul, not him." He shook his head. "It's a damn pity, of course, and all our beasts will be creeping about miserable for days. But there's nothing else for it. Best to get it done, and quickly. Tomorrow morning." Choiseul was given a few moments with Precursorus, the big dragon nearly draped with chains, and watched closely by Maximus and Temeraire on either side. Lawrence felt the shudders go through Temeraire's body as they stood their unpleasant guard, forced to observe while Precursor swung his head from side to side in denial, and Choiseul made a desperate attempt to persuade him to accept the shelter Lenton had offered. It is really sad as we've come to get to know these dragons as like real sort of creatures that maybe could have existed, perhaps. And you could really feel how awful that must be when you think about the bond that the author set up here that they have. At last, the great head drooped in the barest hint of a nod, and Choiseul stepped close to lay his cheek against the smooth nose. Then the guards stepped forward. Precursors tried to lash at them, but the entangling chains pulled him back. And as they led Choiseul away, the dragon screamed, a dreadful sound. Temeraire hunched himself away from it, his wings flaring, and moaned softly. Lawrence leaned forward and stretched himself fully against his neck, stroking over and over. "Do not look, my dear," he said, the words struggling to come through the thickening of his throat. "It will be over in a moment." Precursor screamed once more at the end. Then he fell to the ground heavily, as if all vital force had gone from his body. Lenton signaled that they might go, and Lawrence touched Temeraire's side. "Away, away," he said, and Temeraire launched himself far from the scaffold at once, striking out over the clean, empty sea. "Lawrence, may I bring Maximus over here and Lily?" Berkeley asked in his usual abrupt way, having come upon him without warning. "Your clearing's big enough, I think." Lawrence raised his head and stared at him dully. Temeraire was still huddled in misery, head hidden beneath his wings, inconsolable. They had flown for hours, just the two of them, and the ocean below, until Lawrence had at last begged him to turn back to land out of fear that they would have become exhausted. He himself felt almost bruised and ill, as if feverish. He had attended at hangings before, a grim reality of naval life, and Choiseul had been far more deserving of the fate than many a man Lawrence had seen at the end of a rope. He could not say why he felt such anguish now. "If you like," he said without enthusiasm, letting his head sink down. He did not look up at the rush. "If you like," is I think what Temeraire is saying, to turn back. Without enthusiasm, letting his head sink down, he did not look up at the rush of wings and shadows as Maximus came over the clearing, his enormous bulk blotting out the sun until he landed heavily beside Temeraire. Lily followed after him. They huddled at once around each other and Temeraire. After a few moments, Temeraire unwound himself enough to entwine more thoroughly with them both, and Lily spread her great wings over them all. Berkeley led Harcourt over to where Lawrence sat leaning against Temeraire's side, and pushed her unresisting to sit beside him. He lowered his stout frame awkwardly to the ground opposite them, and handed about a dark bottle. Lawrence took it and drank without curiosity. Strong, unwatered rum, and he had not eaten anything all day. It went to his head very quickly, and he was glad for the muffling of all sensation. Harcourt began to weep after a little while, and Lawrence was horrified to find his own face wet even as he reached to grip her shoulder. He was a traitor, nothing but a lying... it was her. He was a traitor, nothing but a lying traitor, Harcourt said, scrubbing tears away with the back of her hand. "I'm not sorry in the least. I'm not sorry at all." She spoke with an effort, as though she were trying to convince herself. Berkeley handed her the bottle again. "It is not him. Damn rotter deserved it. You're sorry on account of the dragon, and so are they. They don't think much of king and country, you know. Precursors never knew a damn thing about it, but where Choiseul told him to go." "Tell me," Lawrence said abruptly, "would Bonaparte have really executed the dragon for treason?" "Likely enough. The Continentals do, once in a great while. More to scare the riders off the notion than because they blame the beasts," Berkeley said. Lawrence was sorry to have asked, sorry to know that Choiseul had been telling the truth, so far at least. Surely the corps would have granted him shelter in the colonies if he had asked, he said angrily. There's still no possible excuse. He desired his place in France restored. He was willing to risk Precursors to have it back. For we might just as easily have chosen to put his dragon to death. Berkeley shook his head. Knew we are too hard up for breeders to do as much, he said. Not to excuse the fellow. I dare say you're right. He thought Bonaparte was going to roll us up. And he did not like to go and live in the colonies, Berkeley shrugged. Still damn hard on the dragon. And he's not done anything wrong. That is not true. He has, Temeraire put in unexpectedly, and they looked up at him. Maximus and Lily raised their heads as well to listen. Choiseul could not have forced him to fly from France, nor to come here bent on hurting us. It does not seem to me that he is any less guilty at all. I suppose it is likely he did not understand what was being asked of him, Harcourt said tentatively to this challenge. Temeraire said, Then he ought to have refused until he did understand. He is not simple, like Volley. He might have saved his rider's life then, and his honor too. I would be ashamed to let my rider be executed, and not me too, if I had done as much, he added venomously, his tail lashing the air. And I would not let anyone execute Lawrence anyway. I should like to see them try. Maximus and Lily both rumbled in agreement. I will never let Berkeley commit treason, ever, Maximus said. But if he did, I would step on anyone who tried to hang him. I would just take Catherine and go away, I think, Lily said. But perhaps Precursorus would have liked to do the same. I suppose he could not break all those chains, for he is smaller than either of you, and he cannot spray. Although there was only one of him, and he was being guarded, I do not know what I would do if I could not have escaped. She finished softly, and they all began to slump down in fresh misery, huddling together again, until Temeraire stopped and said with sudden decision, I will tell you what we shall do. If ever you need to rescue Catherine, or you, Berkeley, Maximus, I will help you, and you will do as much for me. Then we do not need to worry. I do not suppose anyone could stop all three of us, at least not until we could escape. All three of them appeared immeasurably cheered by this excellent scheme. Lawrence was now regretting the amount of rum he had consumed, for he could not properly form the protest he felt he had to make. And urgently. And forgive me, folks, for the stumbling. It's a little bit later here, long day, but hopefully it's worth it to get through the content. Enough of that, you damned conspirators. You'll have us hanged a great deal sooner than we will, Berkeley said thankfully on his behalf. Will you have something to eat now? We're not going to eat until you do. And if you're so busy to protect us, you may as well begin by saving us from starvation. I do not think you are in any danger of starving, Maximus said. The surgeon said only 2 weeks ago that you are too fat. The devil! Berkeley said indignantly, sitting up, and Maximus snorted in amusement at having provoked him. But shortly the three dragons did allow themselves to be persuaded to take some food, and Maximus and Lily returned to their own clearings to be fed. I am still sorry for Precursorus, even though he acted badly, Temeraire said presently, having finished his meal. I do not see why they could not let Choiseul go off to the colonies with him. There must be a price for such things, or else men would do them more often. And in any case he deserved to be punished for it, Lawrence said. His own head had cleared with some food and strong coffee. Choiseul meant to make Lily suffer as much as Precursorus does. Only imagine if the French had me prisoner and demanded that you fly for them against your friends and former comrades to save my life. Yes, I do see, Temeraire said, but with dissatisfaction in his tone. Yet it seems to me they might have punished him differently. Would it not have been better to keep him a prisoner and force Precursors to fly for us? I see you have a nice sense of the appropriate, Lawrence said. But I do not know if I can see any lesser punishment for treason. It is too despicable a crime to be punished by mere imprisonment. and yet Precursorus is not to be punished the same way, only because it is not practical, and he is needed for breeding, Temeraire said. Lawrence considered the matter and could not find an answer for this. I suppose, in all honesty, being aviators ourselves, we cannot like the idea of putting a dragon to death, and so we've found an excuse for letting him live, he said finally. And, as our laws are meant for men, perhaps it is not wholly fair to enforce them upon him. Oh, that I can well agree with, Temeraire said. Some of the laws which I have heard make very little sense, and I do not know that I would obey them if I were not to oblige you. It seems to me that you wish to apply laws to us. It were only reasonable to consult us on them, and from what you have read to me about Parliament, I do not think any dragons are invited to go there. Next you will cry out for taxation without representation, and throw a basket of tea into the harbor, Lawrence said. You are indeed a very Jacobin at heart, and I think I must give up on trying to cure you of it. I can but wash my hands and deny responsibility. And that, my friends, is the end of Chapter 11. Woof! So we made it all the way to Chapter 12. Not much left of the book now. Thanks for sticking with me if you made it this far, and for going through some of my stumbles and flubs here on a late night, but I want to get the content out to you. This is Nick Sal. Dramatic Readings continue. Check out some of my other books on the channel. Please subscribe. Leave a comment. I always appreciate hearing who's watching this stuff and listening to this stuff, and if you like it. All right. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next one.